Senate Joint Resolution 67 by Budd and others, a resolution to make an application to Congress of the United States to call Article 5 convention for the purpose of proposing amendments to the United States Constitution.
Representative Butt, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move to concur in SJR 0067.
Representative Butt moves to concur in Senate Joint Resolution 67, properly seconded. Representative Butt, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. SJR 67 makes application for the calling of an Article 5 convention under the U.S. Constitution to consider amendments to oppose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and to consider limiting the terms of office for members of Congress and Supreme Court justices. Near the end of the 1787 convention, one of our founding fathers, George Mason, realized that there was nothing in the Constitution that gave states the power to amend the Constitution. He knew there might come a time when the federal government would not restrain itself. At that time, overwhelmingly, those in attendance voted for Article 5 and to give states that opportunity. The first half of Article 5, giving us that opportunity to stand for our states' rights, reads like this. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or upon the application of the legislators of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by the conventions in 3/4 thereof. We all know that right now we're in a position that the federal government is not delegating authority, they are not limiting authority, and our federal budget is ballooning. The EPA, these are adding rules constantly, mandates that we have to follow that are costing our state millions, and it's time for us to take advantage of this constitutional remedy for a federal government that is out of control. So with those comments, I renew my motion.
Representative Butt renews her motion. Discussion. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions and a couple of concerns. The first question is, since this has never, there has never been a process laid out for ratification. You explained very well how Article 5 lays out the front end of the process of how they would go about convening and making their decisions. But then on the back end of the process of when it's time for ratification, there is no specific process laid out for that. It just says it shall be ratified.
By 2/3 of the state.
Or by a convention, which, correct?
The state may call a convention and decide to ratify or not.
And so the member, who would make up a convention? How would a convention be convened, elected, appointed? Who's in charge of that? And I don't expect you to answer all those questions because that's never, and that's my point, it's never been done before. We don't have a process for that, and it creates grave concern for me. That's number one. Number two, 6 years ago in this body, I stood right where you are right now, and I sponsored legislation and passed legislation by 69 members of this body to repeal and rescind every single one of the Constitutional Convention calls that had been passed over many decades, most in the 1970s, but throughout many, many years, including constitutional conventions calling for balanced budget amendments, fiscal restraint. I don't know if term limits was in there or not. Not because anyone necessarily disagrees with those topics. I agree with your previous statement about the federal budget being out of control, needing to have fiscal restraint. I agree with that 100%. But we're talking about process, we're talking about procedure, and we're talking about constitutionality and being able to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that those decisions will not infringe on anything outside of the call. 6 years ago, I stood there for over an hour debating with members of this chamber and we rescinded, as a body, we rescinded, took back every single one of the Constitutional Convention calls because the argument was made that it was necessary, that it was needed, it was vitally important that we rescind those calls. So my question to you today is, if it was vitally important national interest, so constitutional that we need to rescind those calls 6 years ago, and 69 members of this body voted in favor of that, why are we now having a Constitutional Convention call again when just a few short years ago we were all, not all, but a majority of us were in agreement that they needed to be rescinded and taken away?
And I certainly understand that, and I would have been one that voted for that. But those calls were not identical, and when you don't have an identical call from 34 states, then those calls are useless. So the call has to be identical from the 34 states. So that tells you how many times that we have actually tried to say, let's have an Article 5 convention so the states may have some say in some of this. As a matter of fact, we'll go into this after a while if you'd like to, but the fact is that none of those calls could be useful because they weren't identical calls with 34 other states.
Do you feel, Madam Sponsor, and where in this resolution are there protections to make sure that what you are calling for in your resolution is the only things that can be addressed in this convention of the states?
Certainly here in Tennessee we have that assurance because we passed House Bill 1379, which is faithful delegate legislation, which says that if our delegate would vote on anything outside of this call or anything that we have not asked them to vote on, they would come back to Tennessee and that would be a felony. Other states are passing this legislation along with their call. Other states have passed this legislation. So we're protecting ourselves from them happening.
Yes, ma'am. Is there a time limit on this call, or is this an open call?
We have not put a time limit on the call. There's not a time limit on the call at this time because we have to have 34 identical calls.
The last time we did this, as I said, we rescinded calls that had been on the books for almost 40 years, and they were there lingering with a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of doubts. I was attempting to talk to some folks that I know are advocating for this because I understand the need to do everything we can to try to get control of the federal government, the out-of-control spending, the national debt, the deficit, and all of those fiscal matters. I agree with the premise of wanting to get control of that 100%. What I am extremely concerned about is the fact that, number one, there is zero process. There's no specifics on ratification because we've never done it before. There's on the ratification side of it.
Clearly, the Constitution says by 3/4 of the states.
Yes, ma'am, but it does not speak to how those delegates are chosen. It does not speak to who is allowed and qualified to be delegates. It does not speak to any specificity whatsoever about that. That's number one. Number two, it does not speak to. You are correct in the law that we passed, and I voted for that it makes it a felony if they don't hold to their oath. But what happens once they are in that convention of the states? We say that it is to deal with term limits and with the balanced budget amendment, but then someone proposes and gets a motion in a second to then open it up to address other issues, maybe First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment issues. What is to prevent that from happening?
You call your delegate back, but also, besides that, we're talking in this call about limiting the federal government, not giving them any more power over the Second Amendment or anything else.
Who calls the delegate back?
The state legislature, that is what is in our delegation.
But the delegates are not members of the state legislature. Are the delegates elected by the citizens?
They can be, or they can be elected by the legislature. They can be elected either way.
All right. Madam Speaker, I know you have a list, and so I'll sit down, but I would once again contend I agree with the subject matter you're trying to tackle 100%. However, 6 years ago, we needed to get rid of them. If we don't, the Constitution is in shreds. I heard it all. I was a believer in that. I did my homework, my research, and 68 of my colleagues agreed with that. Now, we're right back in the same thing again, and we're wanting to pass these again with, in my opinion, very little to no protections and no specificity of how it will be ratified on the back end. I just think we need to pause and consider those issues. Thank you, Madam Sponsor.
Thank you.
Representative Shaw.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Sponsor Yield.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I know this came through committee the other day, and we talked about it a little bit. First of all, you said it would take 2/3 of the legislature.
2/3 of state legislatures to ratify any amendment, which means 38 states. 13 states could stop any amendment from being ratified.
So we stand here in this chamber every day that we come and we quote for justice, for liberty and justice for all. Do you feel that this would be for liberty and justice for all?
Certainly, I think we have to understand that the states created the federal government, not the other way around. So states have a say in the operation of the federal government. We would send the delegates who represent our state. So certainly, I think every state would have justice involved.
How do you feel about the revenue that we could very well lose if we decide that we want to pull away basically from the federal government? They can't tell us what to do. They have no oversight over us at all. We got over a $30 billion budget. Are we going to raise taxes in Tennessee?
I certainly understand your concern. And just because we balance a budget does not mean we would lose all that revenue in the first place. The second place is how many of us have argued over and over that the revenue that we receive from the federal government comes with so many mandates and so many stipulations. And let me give an example of that. When I first came, there were some things that I wanted to change with the Department of Human Services and Welfare. And I was very excited about that. I thought we can make this work better, more efficiently. And the first thing I heard was that we have a federal mandate for a maintenance of effort clause in our welfare here in Tennessee. And the federal government won't let us make changes that might be more efficient and better for Tennessee. So a lot of times the money that comes back to us, economically, morally, it costs us money. So I think we would be able to handle that.
With all due respect, I understand that there are mandates with money. Madam Chairman of this bill, I've seen this kind of government work before. And it may not be many people in this chamber is old enough to see it, but I've seen it. I'm old enough that I've been through it when the federal government had nothing to do with the state. And I'm reminded this morning of my father who worked hard every day to take care of us and to bring us up in a decent way. And he just decided one day that he wanted to go downtown and register to vote. And the federal government said he could do that. But you know what? The local government said he couldn't. And that's what I see that's going to happen in this kind of legislation when we pull away and we have no longer can the federal government tell us anything, have nothing to do with us. And when you look at the makeup of this chamber, and you think that I believe that my people are going to be taken care of in something such as this, that we're going to get liberty and justice for all, that we're going to be taken care of, that we going, and I don't want to get into the mandate of the federal government because we could have got a whole lot of money last year from the federal government that didn't call for any mandates, but we turned it down. So I don't think we need to talk about that. But I'm talking about the kind of government that you're trying to create that is going to, and you said it's going to be fair for all the people.
And I believe that because our states are the ones who created the federal government in the first place. And what I hear you saying is that you trust the federal government more than you trust the states and the state legislatures. And this is simply an amendment to give the state legislatures a voice.
Well, first of all, the people who are in Washington, for the most part, I didn't send them there, number one. But in terms of who I trust, I don't know which one I trust the most. I don't think that's an issue. My issue is how our government is going to operate when you pass a House Joint Resolution such as this, with no oversight whatsoever. We're going to have oversight over local government, but nobody's going to have oversight over us, and we're just going to do whatever we want to do and the way we want to do it and pull away from everybody else. And I'm going to believe that my people are going to get justice in this kind of government.
I appreciate your concerns. I don't agree with you on that. I think we are giving the states a voice. I don't think anybody's trying to pull away completely from the federal government. This amendment simply says we will meet to consider amendments. It has nothing to do with taking all the control from the federal government.
You will meet to consider.
Consider amendments that are limited in this call.
So you have no more power than just to consider. Is that what you're saying?
Consider and send them back to the states for 38 states to have to ratify.
I understand. It's got to be 38 states.
That's
How
right.
many at this point have already ratified?
No, there aren't any that have ratified this. 4 states have passed this resolution.
that's what I mean.
Including our Senate by an overwhelming majority. This resolution is in 30 other houses this year, so that would make the 34 states. It could take a little longer than that, but I just believe people are ready to say, look, this has been in the Constitution all these years. We've never taken advantage of it. Maybe that's why we are where we are today.
Are you in favor of raising taxes?
No, I'm not in favor of raising taxes at this point.
So where will we get the money from if we don't get the federal government dollars? Where will we get the money
You're
from?
speculating on something that hasn't even happened. This is simply to propose an amendment to balance the budget. That is pure speculation.
But you're speculating as well, Madam Chair. You're speculating as well.
In what respect?
You're speculating that 38 states are going to pass this.
I'm hoping
So
38
you're
states.
speculating. We're both speculating.
I'm hoping that 38 states will pass this.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you giving me a chance to talk to you, but I think this is really kind of pitiful when we look at the fact that we stand here and say we would never do anything that would be injurious to the people we represent.
And
We
I would
pledge a
never do
flag
that.
every day that we're one nation under God. But this doesn't look like we're one nation. It looks like we want to be 2 or 3. Thank you.
Representative Matheny.
That's funny.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. If I could have the body's attention a minute, and Madam Speaker, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to stay on the bill, but I have some respectful anecdotal evidence I want to give with it. I fully support what she's doing today, and it's out of sheer exhaustion to try to make changes. You as a state legislator are 50%, almost 55% less powerful than you were in 1796. And that is because the federal government has usurped its constitutional authority. The state is the fulcrum of power in this country. The state enables local governments to exist. The states enable the federal governments to exist. In this day and age, the federal government enables all of us to exist. More than 50% of the budget that we spend every year has strict strings attached to federal dollars. And it's like the sponsor said, we can't change it, we can't negotiate it, we can't do anything about it. If I have a person sitting right here that needs help, I have to go to Washington, D.C., and wait for months for all that to trickle down to be able to help this person sitting right next to me, that's my constituent. We have tried as a body, bilaterally, bipartisanly, to get our federal legislators in Tennessee, our 11, are not the cause of the situation that we are in right now. However, in an attempt just to be able to bring them to speak to us has been unsuccessful. The animosity is so great that we have not been able to get our 11 federal elected representatives at our invitation to come down and sit with us and talk about relevant, pertinent political issues. Not old stuff, not future stuff, but relevant today. This is the atomic bomb of politics that she's proposing. The constitutional founders knew it was necessary if nothing else worked. The federal government must know the states have mobilized, and we have put an atomic bomb on a plane, and it is flying over the District of Columbia. And if they don't listen, then we're going to get done what needs to get done. The greatest fear the federal government has is that the states are going to send delegates up there to get done what they could not get done, and they're going to lose their job next election because new people from the states went up there and did that. There have been over 200 attempts to amend the U.S. Constitution through this process. None of them have ever succeeded. Several of them have come very close, and each time the federal government has capitulated to the will of the states. I feel this would be no different. I feel once we're on the cusp of sending our own delegates up there to get the job done, they're going to give us what we want. And if that's what it takes, it's time to flex our muscles as a state and do that. If you don't believe me, go talk to Dr. John Weil at MTSU. He is one of the nation's leading Constitutional Convention experts. This is not a runaway process. We are not going to crack the Constitution open and allow every state to put their new amendment in it. That's not going to take away your First Amendment. It's not going to take away your Second Amendment. It's going to be very strict based on what we decide prior to what's going to happen up there. And if we send somebody from Tennessee up there and they don't do what we told them to do, they're going to prison for 25 years. And other states are doing that too. This is simply to tell the federal government that we want more than 50% of the control of our budget and our policy put back into the states. We still want to be part of the union. That's not even a question. But if we don't support this and jump on board with this, we are doomed.
Representative Fitzhugh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I must admit, I've not spent a lot of time looking at this. I've been more concerned about the things for which we took our oath, which health care, which includes jobs, which includes looking after our constituents, which includes looking at this pretty good budget that we've, from a fiscal standpoint, that we're looking at. But I do have some concerns. And as I understand the history of this effort, it started years ago to add a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution, and it hasn't been successful as yet. So are the 3 states that have gone forward so far, is their language exactly the same as ours?
The 4 states, go ahead.
4 states.
The 4 states that have gone with ours, yes, it's exactly the same as
And
ours.
this is from decades ago, is that correct?
No, this language has just started in the past year or two.
Okay. Now, you know, the current language then has extended beyond those issues of the budget and is much broader than it was before. Am I correct on that?
Just to be considered, there are only 3 things that will be considered.
Well, it does call for some direct issues like imposing physical restraint and limiting jurisdiction, but if the other 34 states, or however many there must be, have to be exactly the same, and their changes may not line up with Tennessee's. Is that a possibility?
No, they won't be making changes. They'll be passing the identical joint resolution. There won't be changes made as it goes through the state legislatures.
But each state legislature has its own ability to pass what they want to, does it not?
Then it would not be included in our call. As a matter of fact, just this past year, Congress has initiated a committee to count the calls and to make sure that they are the same calls. So it would have to be this identical call to line up with ours.
Now, this legislation calls for term limits for the offices in the federal government. Is that right?
No, the legislation doesn't call for anything. It only calls for us to consider when we got to the convention if that's something we would want to amend. So it doesn't really say, if you come to this convention, this is what we're doing. This is only to consider these things.
Well, that's one of the problems I have. Now you're saying it's just to consider it, so it could there could be something broader or less broad than what is in this particular legislation. That's my point.
And that's not, the point is we are just considering those things, nothing else. And anything that came out of that convention to be ratified by the 38 states is when the ratification would come. We're only coming together to talk about those things and decide if 34 states can say, yes, we would like to have that amendment, and then send it back to the states. There are so many safeguards built into this.
And these safeguards are included in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Is that correct?
These safeguards
is that where
in Article
you're
5.
Getting the procedures and everything that's involved
In Article 5, yes.
Well, you talked about we talk about federal funds coming to the states. Do you realize that 40% of the budget that's proposed by the governor actually comes from the federal government?
Oh, I'm very aware of that. Yes, I am.
You know what 40% of $30 billion is?
I realize that's a lot of money, and I realize that just because we propose a balanced budget amendment does not mean that some of our own money that we send to them would not come back to us. The money that comes back to us now is loaded with mandates that we have to, it costs us money in some cases to get our own money back. So this doesn't mean that we would never have that money, and I really think that's a shame that people are saying that, because you're going to say we're going to balance our budget, but Tennessee's never going to get another dime of their money back. I personally don't believe that's the case.
Well, you either have to, if you're going to reduce federal taxes or reduce the amount that the federal government gives to the states to balance the federal budget, you're going to have to raise taxes somewhere if the federal money doesn't come down to the states, or somehow this state's going to have to make up $12 billion, which to me is something that I don't think the Tennessee taxpayers would be able to stand.
I think we would leave that to the legislature, to the administration, to the people of Tennessee to figure that out. But I know of instances where people have not taken the federal money simply because it costs them more to do so than to be able to run their business or run their school lunchroom like they had wanted to do it.
Well, Madam Sponsor, I think you've pointed out a lot of things that are not clear about this. But what it is clear to me is that we are putting our entire Constitution at risk if we do this. Nothing in the language of the resolution or in legislation proposed by other states limits that scope of the Constitutional Convention. If we were to succeed and enough states came on board, there's nothing to keep our founding document to be actually thrown out with over 200 years of what we've been living with. We could lose more than just our ability to have enough revenue to run our state. We could use our right to free speech. We could use our right to religion. We could lose our right to bear arms. We could lose, as my colleague from West Tennessee said, the ability for people to vote if we disregarded the federal Constitution. We have changes. We have methods, ladies and gentlemen, to change our Constitution that are there now, that have worked and have been used for over 200 years. The easiest way is to change those 11 people that we have representing us in the federal government. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we should strive to get people to vote for and let them represent us in Washington and make the necessary changes, if any, to our Constitution. So I would urge, ladies and gentlemen, that this is maybe a good idea, maybe at some point in time before at the inception of our Constitution may have been something that could have worked and was there as a safeguard. But I, ladies and gentlemen, don't think that we are in a situation that we want to totally disregard our founding fathers, our Constitution, and the growth and history of our state for over 200 years. Thank you, Madam.
Representative Faison.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Everybody's got to do.
Call for previous question.
Previous question has been called for. There is objection. We're on the board. All those in favor of previous question vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote?
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Clerk, take the vote.
Judd. Barry voted no. But.
Mr. Clerk,
Ayes 57, 31 nay, one present not voting.
previous question fails. We're back on discussion. Representative Stewart.
Representative Butt, you've talked a lot and I think movingly about the federal budget deficit as a problem, and I believe you said this morning that's one of the issues that is behind this effort to have this convention. Could you recall the last president who balanced a budget in the United States? And it's not meant to be a trick question. It was Bill
No.
Clinton, wasn't it, the
That's
Democrat?
my understanding. That's who I believe was the last one.
And the reason I make that point is because it wasn't a million years ago when Congress was able to balance budgets without a constitutional amendment. Under Bill Clinton, the budget was balanced in 1999, in 2000, and 2001. Don't you think that our success during the Clinton administration balancing the budget suggests that that this is a problem that doesn't require an amendment to our Constitution, but just requires us to get back to the business of the state and get back to balancing budgets the way we used to do just 15 years ago?
And I do agree that that was great, that budget was balanced during that time. It was with President Bill Clinton, but he did have a Republican Congress who balanced that budget. So the president doesn't actually do the budget balancing. It's actually the Congress, and he did have a Republican Congress.
Well, let me follow up on that. I realize we've been debating a long time, but see, I would suggest that history tells us that we're not to the point where we need to amend the Constitution. You know, as you point out, Bill Clinton presided over the balancing the budget, but there was a Republican Congress during much of the time he was in office. Similarly, for many years, people thought it would be very hard to lower taxes, but in fact, under a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, taxes were dramatically lowered during the 1980s. Doesn't that suggest that what we really need here is just a renewed consensus around these policies rather than tampering with a Constitution that served our country so well for over 2 centuries?
And that Constitution that has served our country so well gives states the authority to do this. The Founding Fathers voted overwhelmingly for this. And as much as I would like to agree with you, I believe that it is time for states to take advantage of this and to renew the fact that the states have the right to do that. I agree that possibly if 30 states get close to this, I guarantee you we will get Congress's attention and they will say, wait a minute, what is it that they want now? Maybe we should discuss this. And if that's what happens, so be it. But we have this authority in our state to do this.
Representative Weaver.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, I have the most highest esteem and respect for you. You and I agree on so many things. And I stand here in total disagreement with the action of this Article 5. I have labored long and hard over this, and I prayed over this, and I normally don't get up and say very much. But ladies and gentlemen, may I submit to you what the real problem we have is not with the Constitution, but disobedience of our Constitution. Please just be patient with me on this, because I probably won't speak on anything else this whole year but this. But as I look around the room and all of us are exasperated and tired about maybe even the discussion on this, we are talking about the Constitution of the United States of America. SJR 67 is in effect applying to Congress for a convention to change the constitutional standard from one of enumerated powers to whatever is agreed upon at a convention. We have no guidelines. We have no definites. We have no parameters. We're all going on the assumption that everybody's going to be good actors. SJR 67 will likely expand the power of the federal government and present a new one, which to me is the ultimate Trojan horse. This application will open up our Constitution, the whole Constitution, to an amendment, to rewrite, to replace it entirely. And ladies and gentlemen, are you willing to take that risk? Think about that. I'm in agreement with everyone in here. We all, on both sides of the aisle, can say that D.C. is in a royal mess. We all agree to that. But for over 100 years, we have walked in disobedience of our Constitution, one of which is the 17th Amendment. If you continue to take a document and take chunks and chunks out of a document, you end up with a document currently on life support. The 17th Amendment would be the first thing that I would grab for and repeal and bring back to where state legislators choose the voice in our U.S. Senate, where we hold their feet to the fire and cause the U.S. senators to report to the state legislators. That's very frustrating as a state legislator, that we don't have constant communication with our U.S. representatives in D.C.
Great. Well, make sure we're paying attention on the vote.
May I also submit to you that a convention plays right into the hands of those who call our Constitution, quote, imbecilic, archaic, and with evil provisions. The enemies of our republic are counting on left and right working together to rewrite our Constitution. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a perfect storm. So what's our solution? Well, indeed, we can all agree we have a huge challenge before us to restore our constitutional republic. But we start by forcing, as I said earlier, our elected officials to obey the rule of law. We currently are in a climate of lawlessness with no respect to the Constitution.
That's right.
In 1876, a North Carolina governor said this: when you find you have scoundrels and scallywags in office, you need to turn them out, and you need to keep turning them out until you send honorable men or women to Washington. That applies to every level of government. And until we do that, no amendment is going to change anything. They don't obey it now. What makes you think they're going to go by the rules and the guidelines that we send to them in a convention? For federal judges who usurp their powers, of which we have experienced this last summer, what does the Constitution tell us to do? It says impeach them. It says remove them from the bench. Again, may I submit, the problem we have today is disobedience, period. And the key to getting our nation back onto a wiser path is simple obedience. Webster's 1828 dictionary defines deception as follows, and I'm about to close, and I appreciate your indulgence. But to deceive is to mislead the mind, to cause to believe what is false, or to disbelieve what is true. To promote a constitutional convention will result in complete destruction of our already on life support, tattered and battered U.S. Constitution. And this would bring demise to any hope for the return of limited government, free markets, and responsible federalism. I'm going to close with the oath that every one of us have taken when we come down here into these amazing chambers. I will not propose or assent to any bill, vote, or resolution which shall appear to me injurious to the people, or consent in any act or thing whatever that shall have a tendency to lessen or abridge their rights and privileges as declared by the Constitution of this state. So help me God. I suggest that we defend and not amend our republic so that we can keep it. Thank you, members. Thank you, sponsor. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The sponsor yield, please.
Yes, certainly.
And most of my questions, Representative Matthew Hill had already addressed, but I'm not quite clear when we're talking about the process. I'm not clear on how you keep the convention from becoming a rogue convention, what the safeguards are to keep the convention from going into any area whatsoever, going outside of fiscal restraints for Congress, and essentially rewriting the Constitution. Now, I have a lot at stake in that Constitution. From the 14th Amendment on back are very important to me. And in these days of presidential birth of this, that, and the other, I don't see why that wouldn't be an issue, that some maverick within the convention would bring up. So I'm very skeptical about the process itself. Can you allay my fears?
Sure, the process is laid out in Article 5, and that the calls are limited. Our call calls for limiting government regulation, calls for considering a balanced budget, considering term limits. But, Representative, that doesn't mean we're going to get any of that. We're going to come to a convention. The delegates representing the people of their state will discuss those things. And then a huge safeguard is that anything that would come out of that convention would come back to the 50 states for ratification. So 38 states would have to ratify anything that came out of that convention. That allows 13 states to stop anything. And, you know, I'm questioning people that say, well, this is going to open up the Constitution. This is in the Constitution. This Article 5 is our constitutional remedy for the states to have a voice in making amendments. So we are just doing what the Constitution says. And when somebody makes the comment, well, why would they listen to us? They would listen to us because 38 state legislatures said this is the amendment we would like to propose.
Okay, but you say 38 states may accept and ratify the amendments that are offered
That is
coming
the
out
bar
of the
that is
Constitution.
set. That's how many it would take.
But you still haven't addressed my concerns on how to keep the convention itself on track. From my readings and from the research that has been offered to me, most of which I didn't ask for. I think most of the chamber received quite a few emails on this. There's two sides of this discussion, and I still don't have confidence, and that's why I wanted to hear directly from you. I still don't have confidence that there's anything that will keep this constitutional issue focused on fiscal restraint.
Our call makes it focus on three things. And if your delegate does not discuss those three things, they come back to the state of Tennessee and it's a felony if they go outside the scope of this call for the convention.
But, ma'am, the other representatives, and I don't mean state representatives, the other representatives, members who attend, will not be bound by Tennessee law. And if they choose to act, there's absolutely nothing we can do except say we don't agree. Is that correct?
But their states can call them back. Representative Reedy, did you want to say?
Okay, Tennessee can call our delegates back. But there's nothing that we can do to undo what the rest of the convention decides to do. Whatever direction they decide to go on,
but right now,
they will be able to do so. Is that correct?
Right now, in the state houses where they're passing the Convention of States, faithful delegate legislation is going along with those calls for the convention.
Yes, ma'am, but we are being, and I don't want to get into the discussion that you and Representative Shaw had, but we're speculating when we talk about what the other state houses are going to do. So I'm not comfortable that we aren't literally opening up Pandora's box where we would have any and everything on the table at that convention, and it would literally destroy these United States of America as we know it today. I'm also strongly convinced that whatever the problems are in Washington, D.C., an educated voter is the cure. So I thank you for indulging me.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I'm still not comfortable, and I'll have to vote against your...
Representative Reedy, you're recognized.
Thank you, ma'am.
Esteemed colleagues, as state legislators, what can you and I do? The founders predicted the day might come when Washington, D.C. would no longer be responsive to the states and the citizens. D.C. has stolen power from the states and personal liberties from the citizens, including whittling away at our Second Amendment rights. The founders looked to their own experience and provided us the solution to put D.C. back in a box. The solution is based on a well-known, consistent, and tested process that has been used 30 times in the last 100 years prior to 1787. 11 of those times were in the 11 years prior to 1787. It is the process in which most of the founders had participated, including Roger Sherman, who did so 5 times prior to 1787. The process in which they put their faith in the Interstate Convention, they provided this solution as a regular and bloodless, I might add, path to restore the balance of power. This well-documented process was last used in 1922 for the Santa Fe Convention, which produced the Colorado River Compact. So in fact, it has been used, which occurred before our lifetimes. We have allowed our lack of personal experience with interstate conventions distort our vision. Thankfully, the history of interstate conventions and our founders' views on them has been brought back to life through research. At state legislators, the founders directly authorized you and I to bypass Congress, the Supreme Court, the President, and even the state governors. The founders gave you and I the power to initiate and control the process to rein in the federal behemoth, restore state rights, restore personal liberties, and save our republic. Citizens or civilizations rise and fall. Let's be a civilization that sees the cycle of collapse coming and break it. I look forward to standing with Representative Butts as we perform this duty given by the founders and save our republic, and I hope you vote for SJR 67.
Representative Womack.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Remember,
Representative
Sponsor
Butts,
yield.
you asked to
I'm
yield.
sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Yes,
all right.
I yield.
A few questions. Number one, again, tell me how the delegates are going to be selected for the Constitutional Convention.
And that will be each state will determine how their delegates are selected. We have that in our faithful delegate legislation here in Tennessee.
How are they selected?
Let me find our legislation. The General Assembly shall by joint resolution determine the method for which the delegates will be elected, the number of delegates allocated to represent Tennessee, and an equal number of alternate delegates under rules adopted by the House and the Senate.
So we really don't have anything in place right now for the process of how they're going to be selected. So that leads me to my next question is, what will their qualifications be? Will they be lawyers? Will they be farmers? Who will they be, and what will their minimum qualifications be?
And that will be left to our state house to decide. Across the nation, every state house will make those determinations.
There's only been one other Article 5 convention, right? Representative Butt?
One other Article 5 convention. Are you talking about the 1787 convention or the other conventions that have been had across the years? The last convention was in 1922.
Right. And the one before that, 1777, what happened there?
I think there's a lot of misleading history about that because actually we did come out with the Constitution. We came out with the Constitution that gives us the authority to do what we want our state to do today.
And I agree with you on that, but we left the Articles of Confederation in the back room and we created a whole new Constitution. That's my fear here, is we risk losing the rights of our current Constitution because this Article 5 convention, folks, is going to open up the entire Constitution, and there's no guarantee that we can say you can't touch the Second Amendment, you can't touch the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment. It's all on the table. And Representative Butt, here's my concern, and this is what really bothers me. I believe so strongly in the Constitution. I trust the Constitution, but what I don't trust are the current politicians, the the current political leadership on both sides of the aisle at the local and the federal and the state levels. We don't know. We don't have anything in concrete here in place. We are really treading out into the black, not knowing where we're going.
And that's just really not the truth, because we have set in our call the only things we can discuss in that convention. And we're using the very Constitution that you are adhering to do this. This is our constitutional authority to do this. This has nothing to do. We only come together to consider amendments. There is nothing in this call that says we can change anything about the current Constitution. We are just using this Constitution to take this opportunity for our states to be heard.
And I agree with you in Tennessee. But when you go to places like New York, and believe me, you meet some of the people in New York who are in government, California, Washington State, Colorado. Oh, shoot, we're legalizing marijuana against federal law. And nothing's being done. It's not, they're going to do things contrary to what we believe in Tennessee. You've got 50 other players in this game, and they're not going to be thinking like us here in Tennessee. And they're not going to send legitimate delegates with legitimate qualifications to these conventions. We're going to be outnumbered. We're going to, and as far as I know, Colorado's going to send folks that are going to be high.
And that's their constitutional right to send that. However, those people shouldn't be high, because if the federal government was prosecuting them like they should be, then they wouldn't be high. But the fact is, the federal government selectively prosecutes who they want to prosecute.
I agree, but we have to look at the current landscape where we're at in 1990 to 1999 to 2016. I'm going to go ahead and I'll stop right there, but I just want to say I can't support that for those reasons. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Representative Todd.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let's see if we can move previous question.
Previous question has been called for. Is there objection? There is objection. We're on the board. Those in favor of previous question vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, take the vote.
I-66, 19A, one present not voting.
Previous question prevails. Representative Butch, you're recognized for closing remarks.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the brisk discussion. I appreciate it more than you know, because all of these things have been talked about for many years. But I want you to remember this. States created the federal government, not the other way around. The power rests in the people and in the states. We have lost that power with a massive, out-of-control federal government. For 2 years, we have asked for the bilateral Congress. No one has even said they would come from our federal delegation and speak to us here in the House. Now is the time for the states to take the liberty given to us by the Founding Fathers in Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States. If we had done that before, if we had had some of these states' conventions, perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today, cowering to a dictatorial federal bureaucracy. To echo a phrase used in another very trying time, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I believe your vote today is either going to be one of courage or one of fear. I'm going to stand for states' rights and for the people of the state of Tennessee, and courageously vote for a convention of the states to propose amendments to the Constitution of the United States, as the Article 5 in that Constitution gives us the authority to do. And with that, Madam Speaker, I renew my motion.
Representative Butt renews her motion. We're voting on Senate Joint Resolution 67. All those in favor vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, take the vote.
Ayes 59, 31 nay, one present not voting.
Senate Joint Resolution 67 have received a constitutional majority. I hereby declare it concurred in. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is tabled. Next bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and House members.